subscribe and click the bell icon to turn on notifications.
We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome from me to today's webinar on possibly my favorite topic in Excel, which is pivot tables. For those of you who are attending our webinars for the first time, I'll briefly introduce myself. My name's Deborah Ashby and I'm an IT trainer specializing in Microsoft products. So I basically design, facilitate and deliver training both online and in the classroom. Now, if you're someone who needs to analyze data, extract meaning from numbers and present data in an effective way, then pivot tables is going to be the number one thing that you need to know. So let's take a look at today's agenda. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the data set that we're going to be analyzing. It's super important that you understand the numbers that you're looking at before we attempt to analyze it. So we'll take a couple of moments just to look at that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of cleaning your data prior to analyzing it. I'm not actually going to show you how to clean your data because that is an entire other webinar all on its own, but I am going to point you to some resources which are really going to help you with that. We're then going to format our data as an Excel table, another thing that's really important before you analyze. And then we're going to create our very first pivot table. Very exciting if you've never done one before. I'm going to show you how simple it is to analyze your data by pivoting the table fields. I'm going to talk to you about grouping data and value field settings. Now, I'm sure that they don't mean a great deal to you at the moment, but they will do at the end of this session. If we can move on to the next slide, Adam. Thank you. Adam's controlling.
I'm sorry,
today.
Deb. Yeah, you can see this is a well-oiled machine. Deb's and I, we do these a lot, but we normally are in control of our own slides, and I'm in control of Deb's slides at the moment. So that's why it's not gone as smoothly as it could be. So apologies. I'm trying to reply to comments and do the slides, but I'll focus on the slides, Debs.
No worries, you're fine, don't worry. Next, we're going to take a look at number formatting because that does take on a different form when you're working with pivot tables. We're going to talk about subtotals, grand totals, report layouts. I'm going to show you how to make your data look a little bit nicer using PivotTable styles. And then I'm going to show you how you can create pivot charts from pivot tables. In the final section, I'm going to show you a little bit about filtering using something called slicers. And then finally, at the end, one of the most important things, how can you update data across your pivot tables and pivot charts easily? So that is the agenda. Now, contrary to popular belief, pivot tables are not too difficult to understand or put together. And that's really my main aim in this session, to demystify them and show you how simple it is to analyze large data sets. And in this webinar, we're going to start from the point of zero knowledge. So if you've never constructed a pivot table before, that's totally fine. I've got you covered. Even if you do have some experience, you're still going to get a lot out of this session, as I'm going to show you lots of tips and tricks to help you work more effectively with your pivot tables. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and then we're going to dive straight in. So just bear with me for another slick transition. Let's click on share and I'm going to hide that. And
I managed to unshare mine at the right time then.
You did, Adam. I'm very
You're onto a winner.
Yeah. Can everybody see my spreadsheet? Can you see my spreadsheet?
I can see a spreadsheet.
You can. Perfect. Great.
Else can as well.
Right, guys, let's dive in. So first of all, let's take a look at understanding the data that we're going to be analyzing. Now, this is fairly straightforward data. It's just sales data for two different stores. And you can see the stores there. They're called Computech and Microworld. Not real stores, just ones I've made up. And this is sales data from January to June 2019. Now, this is a reasonably large data set. Now, if I press Control down arrow, that's going to jump me down to the last row of my data. So you can see how large it is. I have 21,576 rows, so a decent sized data set. Control up arrow to jump to the top. The way that I have this organized is just into a few different columns. So I have the month, I have the store, the town, and these are all towns in the UK if you're not from the UK, the store code, the country, the manager, the category, and then the sales total at the end. Now, one of the most important things this is going to be one of the most important things that I'm going to say in this session. Before you start creating your pivot table, you must ensure that your data is clean. Now, what do I mean by clean? Well, it needs to be consistent and it needs to be formatted correctly. Now, the example that I have here, it's a very contrived example. It's one that I've just put together. But as we all know, in the real world, things aren't always perfect. So a lot of the time we're downloading large data sets from external systems or client databases, and it doesn't always download in the perfect format. So you might find you have things like blank rows or data squished into one cell that should be separated into different columns. You might have inconsistent spaces or even duplicate entries and spelling errors. And all of these things need to be fixed prior to putting your data into a pivot table. Because if you don't clean your data, then what you'll find is that your pivot table won't work as expected, or it's going to throw up incorrect results. Now, as I said, in a PivotTables training course, I would normally demonstrate all the techniques for cleaning data. But as we just have limited time today, we're going to start from a data set that's already clean. I will say, though, that if you do want to learn about cleaning data, then we do have a couple of videos on our YouTube channel. It's also on our blog, and all of the steps for cleaning data are included in our Simon Sez IT PivotTables courses as well. So if you're looking for more information on that, that is where you can go. Right, shall we start doing something? Let's get going. The final thing I always do prior to analyzing with a pivot table is I put my data into a regular Excel table. And I'm going to tell you why this is so important in a moment. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can put data into a table. I'm just clicked in the table. If I press Control T, that's going to create a table for me. Alternatively, if I just press Cancel here, I can jump up to my Home tab. And in the Format as Table drop-down, I can then choose one of these different styles, which is essentially going to format my data as a table. Now, the different styles that you get in here are very much dependent on the theme that you're using in your Excel workbook. So I'm just going to choose this style here, Purple Table Style Light 14. You can see it puts the marching ants around my data set, and it's picked up all of my data because I was clicked within my data. So it just picks up everything from around where you're clicked. Yes, my table has headers. I want to make sure I have that selected. Click on OK, and it puts my data into an Excel table. How do I know that? Well, if I look up at my ribbons, you can see I now have an additional ribbon called Table Design. And in the first group where it says table name, I have a default name for my table called Table 1. Now, I would always advise you to rename your table. So give your table a more meaningful name so it's easy for you to identify later on. So I'm going to call this table Sales _ Data and hit Enter. Now, when you're naming things like tables, you can't have any spaces in the name. So it has to be all one word or separate separate words with underscores. So I've now named my data. So now I'm at the point where I can start to create my pivot table. This is very straightforward. Up to the Insert tab in the Tables group here, the first big old button that we have is Pivot Table. So let's click it and see what we get. So it's going to pop up the Create Pivot Table dialog box. And there's really two things that we need to do in here. The first thing is we need to choose the data that we want to analyze. And by default, it's selected, select a table or range. And it's picked up the name of my table, so sales _ data, which is the data that I want to analyze. So I don't need to do anything here. It's picked everything up correctly. If it hadn't, what I could do is click the up arrow and then just go in and select the data set by dragging my mouse over to get that correct cell range. Then finally at the bottom, we need to choose where we want the pivot table report to be placed. And in general, I would always advise you that you keep your raw data, your sales data, separate to any pivot tables that you create. So I always create mine on a new worksheet. So don't really have to change anything here. That's nice and straightforward. Click on OK. And you'll see what it does is it gives me a new worksheet at the bottom. You can see I have sheet 3. Now, just to be consistent, I'm going to rename this so I know what I'm doing to pivot table and hit enter. So now I have essentially my pivot table report, which is currently blank. So this thing over here where it says pivot table 2 on the left hand side, this is where my pivot table is going to be, but I need to build it first. So how do I build my pivot table? Well, I use my pivot table fields over on the right hand side. Now, these fields are essentially the column headings from your data set. It imports all of the column headings. So we've got month, store, town, so on and so forth. And then underneath that, we have these 4 different areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. And the way that you construct a pivot table is you simply drag and drop the different column headings into one of these 4 areas at the bottom. It is really that simple. Now, which ones you drag into which areas really depends on the type of analysis that you want to do. So let's take a look at a few basic examples. So maybe I want to see the total amount of sales per store. What I would do here is I would grab my store field and I'm going to drag and drop this into the rows area. And look what happens to the pivot table report when I do this. I only have 2 stores, so you can see it's put them in the rows, Computech and Microworld. I want to see the sales, so I'm going to grab the sales field and I'm going to drag that down and drop it into the values area. And it does a sum, so it's now showing me the total amount of sales for Computech and the total amount of sales for Microworld. I could choose to arrange this layout in a different way, and that is all you're really doing. When you're dragging and dropping these fields, you're just telling Excel how you want this data analyzed and laid out. So what happens if I drag store into columns? Let's give it a go. Let's drag it across. And you'll see my data arranges in a slightly different way. So this time I have the stores in the columns and I have my values underneath. And you can see that by default, it's given me a grand total as well. What if I decide I want to arrange this in a different way or see a completely different analysis? What if I want to see which manager is performing the best and generating the most sales? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of store because I'm no longer interested in store. I want to see my analysis by manager. So I'm going to drag manager down into the rows area. So now I get all of the managers in my rows and how many sales or how much sales they've generated. Okay. And what I can do is if I want to see who's doing the best, I can do a simple sort on this data by right-clicking my mouse, going to sort and saying sort largest to smallest. So I can see that Spencer Lee is my star. He's my star manager, the one who's generating the most sales. What about if I drag manager across into columns? What does that look like? Well, it works, but it's not the greatest layout for this type of data. I don't want to have to scroll across. It's much easier for me to see when I have it down in rows. So this is a little bit of trial and error, moving things around until you get it to look exactly as you want it to look. Let's switch up our data again. So this time, maybe I want to switch up my analysis to see which town in the UK is generating the most sales. All I'm going to do is drag manager out of rows. I'm going to grab town and I'm going to drop that down into the rows area. So this is an example of very basic data analysis using pivot tables. Fairly straightforward once you know. So now that we've got that basis, let's take this up a notch. Maybe I now decide that I want to see the total sales by manager and by category. So I'm going to get rid of town. I'm going to drag my manager field into the rows area. I'm going to drag my category field into the columns area. So now you can see I have the manager in the rows and my categories running across the top. And again, by default, I have grand totals turned on. Very simple to see that breakdown. Now, so far in all of these examples, we've just been adding one heading into each area. But you can have multiple headings in the same area to produce a completely different layout. So what if I now take category from columns and drag it above manager in the rows area? Look what happens to my layout. You can see how this is now organized. I get these little collapsible and expandable buttons. It's being organized by category first and then all the sales for the manager for that specific category. And I can collapse these up and zero in on the ones that I'm particularly interested in. Okay, so don't think that you can just put one column heading in each area. You can drag multiple into each area. Now, one area that we haven't talked about is this filters area. We haven't put anything in there yet. So let's do that so you can see how that works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the store field and I'm going to drag that into filters. Now, again, look at the report layout. Right at the top now, I have a little filter, and this works in exactly the same way as regular Excel filters. If you're used to filtering data in a normal Excel worksheet, this is pretty much the same. So it's showing me both of the different stores, and I can now filter. So if I'm only interested in seeing information for Computech, I can select it, click on OK, and all of my figures update. Okay, so filter can be super useful. Let's do a slightly different analysis now. I'm going to remove manager from rows. I'm going to drag category across to columns, but I'm going to now drag month down into rows. Now look what happens in the rows area when I drag month. It's added it, but it's also given me another field that I don't have in my data essentially called months. Now, why has it done this? Now, you'll find when you're dealing with dates, when you drag month down, it might break it into months, it might break it into days, years, whatever you have in your data. So why has it done that? Well, if we take a look at our data, you can see here I have January to June and I have plus and minus symbols next to them. If I just expand these, you can see that I have 1st of January, 1st of February, 1st of March, so on and so forth. And that's because in my raw data, I basically take a reading of the sales data on the 1st of every month. So in my data, I have the 1st of January, then as we scroll through, the 1st of February, 1st of March, because that's when I'm logging those sales figures. Now, in this particular instance, this isn't particularly useful having 1st of January, 1st of February, because it's basically the same as the January figure. So I don't really need it. This is useful if I was taking readings of my data every week. So if I had readings every day or every week, it might be useful to see those listed underneath January. But for me, these aren't particularly useful. So I'm going to get rid of this 1st of January, 1st of February, 1st of March, because I just want Jan, Feb, March listed here. Now, there's a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can just drag the field out of the rows area, but let me show you kind of why it does this, okay? We're going to jump up to our pivot table contextual ribbons. Now, if you're not familiar with contextual ribbons, they're ribbons that only appear when you need them. So when I'm clicked in my pivot table, as I am now, if you take a look up at the ribbons, you can see I have a pivot table analyze ribbon and a pivot table design ribbon. And these ribbons contain all of the commands that you need to change the settings in your pivot table, to format it, all things like that. So if I go to Pivot Table Analyze, you'll see that I have, if I click in here, a grouping option just here, a group, I should say. And one of the options is Group Field. Now, if I click this, it's showing you what Excel is going to do. So it's breaking it down by days and by months, which is why I'm getting both of these pieces of information in here. Now, I only want it to display the months, so I'm going to deselect days, click on OK, and now I just see January to June. I don't have that other little field that it added in. As I said, sometimes that can be super helpful, but for this type of data, not as helpful today. All right, let's move on. So we're going to talk about value field settings next. Now, one thing you'll notice is that when you start compiling your pivot tables is that Excel by default does a sum. It aggregates the values as it summarizes them. So I'm seeing the total amount of sales for the accessories category for January, so on and so forth. But sum isn't the only thing that you can do with this data. You have lots of other functions that you can use. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do a count instead. So maybe I am less interested in the total sales and more interested in the number of sales each month. So what I'm going to do is if I go down to my values area where I have sum of sales, I'm going to click the little drop down arrow and go to value field settings. And you can see here I can choose what I want to summarize my values by. So by default, it's going to do a sum, but I have lots of other things in here that I can also do. So if I want to see the number of sales instead of the total amount, I could say count, click on OK, and it's going to change the data in my pivot table. So now I'm seeing how many sales there were as opposed to the total amount in dollar value. What about if I want to do something different and see the average sales each month? Well, I can do pretty much the same thing, but I'm going to show you a different way of getting to that value field settings screen. Instead of going down here, you can just right-click in your data and you have a value field settings option in the contextual menu. It's going to take us to that same screen. I can choose average, click on OK, and it now gives me averages instead of sum, instead of sum, and instead of count. Okay, so reasonably straightforward. Now, in those examples, we've been doing either or. So I can either see the count, or I can either see the average, or I can either see the sum. But what if I want to see both the total sales and the number of sales? Well, we can do that as well. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to reorganize this layout slightly so that this is a bit easier for you to see and understand. So what I'm going to do is drag category underneath month so that it's organized in this way. I can see the average of sales. I'm actually going to change this back to, let's do a sum, take that back to how it was. And I also want to now see a count of the sales in another column. So how can I do that? Well, all I need to do is grab another sales field and drag it down into the values area. You can see it says sum of sales too. So by default, it's always going to do a sum, but it's giving me an additional column. So I can now right click, value field settings, and I can choose count. And now I can see both of those pieces of information next to each other. Now I could carry on going if I wanted to. If I wanted to see the average next to these figures as well, I would just drag another sales field down to here and change it to average. And you can carry on going for as many things as you need to see. Now, with these things here, you can see that the headings aren't particularly user-friendly, sum of sales and count of sales. So I'm going to change these headings. If I double click, it's going to open up this area here and I can choose the name that I want. So I'm just going to say total sales for this one. I'm going to double click again and I'm going to call this one number of sales to make it a little bit more meaningful. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange these columns a little bit. I'm just going to make them a little bit wider because this is a really important, what I like to call a pro tip, because this is one of those things that nobody ever tells you and it's very annoying. If you decide to rearrange, or not rearrange, but widen the columns, so maybe you move these in or out depending on how you want them to look. What you'll find is that if you refresh your pivot table or you start to do different things with it, Excel will always resize your column widths to auto fit. So if you drag these out and make them look all nice how you want them to look, the next time you refresh your pivot table, they're going to go back to how they were originally. It's extremely annoying. So I'm going to show you a little quick tip so that the width that you set always remains. Okay. Click in your pivot table. Again, we're working on the pivot table analyze ribbon. In this first group, you have an options button. Let's click it because this is where you'll find this little setting. And it's towards the bottom here, the second one from the bottom, auto fit column widths on update. By default, you'll probably find that that is ticked. So I'm going to deselect this, click on OK, and it means that my column widths are going to stay in the width that I've set them no matter what I do to this pivot table. Really useful little pro tip there. Now, one thing you might be conscious of as we've been working through is these values that I have in this total sales area. So you can see here that they aren't particularly formatted. And ideally, what I'd want here is these numbers formatted to show the dollar symbols and also 0 decimal places. Now, many of us are used to applying number formatting in Excel, but another little tip here, you can't apply formatting in pivot tables the same way that you do in just a regular data set. So most of us, if we have a list of numbers and we want to change them to currency format, we would jump up to the Home tab. We would probably click this drop down and change it to currency. But the thing you have to bear in mind here is that when you apply formatting in this way, you're actually assigning the formatting to the cell, not the number. Now, because with pivot tables, the data is moving around all the time because you might decide to rearrange your pivot table fields. So what you end up with is, because the formatting is assigned to the cell, when you move these around, you'll end up with some cells being formatted with dollar signs, some cells with nothing. So you have to apply number formatting in a different way. You want to apply it to the number so it moves with the number whenever you change the format. And it's very straightforward. Just click on one cell in your data, right click, and we want to go down to value field settings again. And you'll notice at the bottom here, we have a number format option. And this is where you need to come. And it takes you to a similar screen. You've probably seen this screen many times before. I'm going to select currency. I want it to be in dollars, but I'm going to take those decimal places down to 0 and click on OK and OK again. And now it's applied that number formatting. Okay, so very, very simple to do, but just remember you can't apply it in the same way that you normally would. Now, another thing you might have noticed is subtotals and grand totals. Now, currently, in the way that I have my pivot table laid out, my subtotals are kind of up here at the top of my data. So these are my subtotals for all of January. Now, if you're happy with your subtotals being at the top, that's absolutely fine. You can definitely leave them there. But I know that for me, when I'm reading data, I am used to having subtotals at the bottom. So I want to move these to the bottom. Fortunately, in Excel, there is a button that's going to do this for us very quickly. So let's jump up to the Design tab. And this is where you'll find all of the commands related to the look and feel of your pivot table. In the first group here, the layout group, you'll see we have a subtotals drop down. I can choose to not show subtotals at all, or I can show them at the bottom of the group or at the top of the group. So I'm going to say show subtotals at bottom of group. And that's just going to move those down. And I just find that a lot easier for me to read. What you'll also notice, if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, we have a grand total. And again, this might be something that you want to keep in your data. If you want to remove it, then you do have a grand totals button as well. So you can turn it off for rows and columns, on for rows only, on for columns only, so on and so forth. So very straightforward just to modify those attributes. Now let's stick on this design ribbon for the time being. If we move across to the next little group, you can also choose different types of report layout as well. So if you take a look, if I go to compact form, this is basically the same as what I have, but it moves those subtotals back up to the top. You can show in outline form, which gives you a slightly different layout. Here we have January and then all of our categories and all of our sales. Now, if you wanted January to appear next to every single category, you could choose to repeat all item labels. And when I do that, it's going to put it in that format. We have the opposite, do not repeat item labels, to take those away. And we have a final way of laying out our reports, and that is in tabular form. And these are really just stylistic changes. There's not one specific one that's better than others. It really depends on how you like to have your report laid out. Next to that, we have a blank rows option. So again, this might be something you want to add in. If I click Insert Blank Line after each item, that's just going to add a blank row. You can see I've got a blank row here now in row 15 in between each month, essentially. So it just adds a bit of separation, makes it a little bit easier to read. Again, if you're not too bothered about that, you can remove the blank line after each item as well. Then moving across to PivotTable Styles. Again, we're just dealing with the look and feel because sometimes you want it to match certain colors, certain brand guidelines, things like that. So you have a large PivotTable Styles gallery where you can choose what style you want for your pivot table. Now, I will say again that the colors that you see in here are very much determined by the theme that you have set in Excel. And if you don't know what I mean by theme, you'll find your theme on the page layout tab. It's just here, and it's basically what defines what fonts, what colors, what effects you use in your worksheet. So whatever you have your theme set to, that's going to determine the colors that are available in that PivotTable Styles gallery. So I'm just going to add, let's just apply, what does this one look like? Yes, let's just do that, a nice shade of purple. A couple of other little tips. Let's jump back to our Pivot Table Analyze ribbon and cast our eyes across to the last group, the show group on the end. I have 3 buttons in here and currently they're all selected, which is why they've kind of got a grey shaded background. Now, these control what you see on your pivot table. Now, if I deselect field list, you'll see that that big field list that normally runs down the right-hand side where I can move my pivot table fields around has disappeared. Now, when you click in your pivot table, that field list should automatically pop up. And when I used to work on a help desk, I used to get this call all the time. People telling me, I've clicked in my pivot table, but the field list hasn't come up. What's happened to it? How do I get it back? If that does happen, if you lose your field list and you're clicked in your pivot table, you're just probably going to have this field list button deselected. So just go in, select it, and it will appear again. If you want to remove the plus and minus symbols next to the months, you can deselect plus minus to make that look a little bit different. And you can also remove field headers. So that's just going to remove where I have the row, sorry, let me turn that back on again, row labels in cell A3. That's not really providing much information. If I don't want that there, I can just turn off that field header. So very straightforward. So we've got a fairly decent looking pivot table here. We've moved our fields around. Hopefully you can see how you can build these up and do different types of analysis. What we might want to do at this stage is create ourselves a lovely looking pivot chart because we're all about visualizing data these days. This is what you'll find. The world has very much gone towards making everything look pretty, creating dashboards, making data super easy to understand. And that is where charts can help us. So let me show you some examples of pivot charts, and I'll show you some basic edits that I normally do to my charts. Now, I will say, when you create or when you decide to create some kind of chart, you need to be mindful of the chart that you use, as some display your data better than others. And in my experience, charts tend to work best with smaller data sets. I'm sure we've all had experiences where you've been watching a PowerPoint presentation and people have tried to cram too much data onto a chart so that it's barely readable, or you have lots and lots and lots of labels in the axes. That's not the greatest way to do charts. The best way to use charts is really to refine your data down just to the information that's most important to your audience and then present that data. So let me show you an example of a couple of ways that you shouldn't really do charts. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a copy of my worksheet. Now, a quick way of creating a copy is if you hold down your control key, and I'm going to be clicking on the pivot table worksheet right at the bottom here, hold down control, click and drag, and that's basically going to create another copy of your worksheet. I'm happy with it being called Pivot Table 2. That's absolutely fine in this instance. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change my fields around on this worksheet. So I'm going to get rid of everything except store and total sales. So let's remove all of these. And I'm going to add in the manager field. I'm going to drag that down to the rows area. And I'm also going to change the filter. I'm going to change that to microworld and click on OK. So I have my data arranged in a slightly different way. Now I have a number of different managers here and I have a grand total at the bottom. Now, if I wanted to put this data into a chart, let's take a look at what that's going to look like. So if you want to create a pivot chart, if you jump back up to your Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, in the Tools group, you have a Pivot Chart option. So let's click. Now, just for this example, I'm going to select just a basic column chart. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, I still have quite a lot of data here. I could probably get away with this in a presentation. Any more data, and this would start to look a little bit crammed, a little bit harder to read. I could probably get away with this, but it's not ideal. It's still quite a lot for people to take in. So what I might want to do here is look at my data and think, okay, what do my audience need to know? So maybe I'm presenting to a CEO or some key stakeholders, and they're only really interested in who the top 5 performing managers are. They only want to know the best of the best. So I'm going to refine my data set first before putting it into a table, into a chart, sorry. So what I'm going to do is I am going to apply a filter. So I'm going to right click in the total sales column. I'm going to go down to sort. Sorry, I'm not going to go down to sort. I think I need to turn my row labels back on. Just bear with me. Design. I'm going to turn back on my field header. That's what I was looking for. I need my little drop down. I'm going to click in my drop down, go to value filters, and I'm going to filter for top 10. And what you can do in here is basically say, I want to filter for the top 10 items based on the total sales. Now, I don't want to see the top 10. I want to see the top 5 items, and click on OK. And that's going to show me the top 5 managers. So this is now a much smaller data set for me to create a pivot chart from. So let's jump back up to Pivot Chart, and I'm going to do a bar chart and click on OK. And now this is a lot easier to digest, a lot easier to see, a lot easier to read. So let's take a look at some basic formatting that I would normally do to any pivot chart that I create. Now, when you create a chart, what you'll see are these grey buttons will appear on your chart, and these are essentially filters, so you can do some in-chart filtering if you wanted to. Now, I find these a little bit overkill. You might like them and you can definitely keep them on there. I find them overkill. If I'm going to do filtering, I tend to do it in my pivot table, which will update the chart anyway. And I find that these grey buttons or these grey filters take up quite a bit of space and make my chart look a little bit messy. So I tend to like to get rid of these. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say hide all field buttons on chart, which will just get rid of those. What else do I need to do to this chart? Well, I can see here I've got my managers running down the side. I've got my total sales across the bottom. I don't really need my legend because legend is just saying everything in yellow is a total. I already know that, so I don't need the legend. Now, when you're formatting your charts, if you click on this plus symbol at the side, this is where you can turn off and on different chart elements. So I have the legend turned on, so I'm just going to deselect that to turn that legend off and get rid of that little legend at the side. What else do I want to do here? Well, I want to add a chart title. Now the chart title is just a text box. Currently it says total, so all I need to do is double click in here and add my chart title. So this is going to be, oops, I'm in caps, total sales, my manager, and this is just for Microworld at the moment. So let's add the company name. So now everybody can see immediately what this chart is representing. I'm going to add a few more things to my chart. So I'm going to click the plus, and what else do I want to add? Maybe some axes titles so that these are super easy to understand. So I have my vertical category axis. So let's change that to, this is manager. Oops, have I spelt that wrong? Oh, it's very hard to read vertically. I'm going to click my axis title at the bottom, and let's rename this to sales and click away. Again, those are just text boxes. Another thing I might want to add might be some data labels. So I'm going to add those so you can also see the values on the chart as well. Okay, so with just a few minor modifications, I've made this chart a lot easier to understand. Now, it might be that I want to maybe change what I'm viewing on this chart. So I'm going to make some modifications to the pivot table or the pivot chart essentially. Now, with the pivot chart clicked, if I jump up to pivot chart analyze, and I'm just going to close down this format chart area so we can see our fields. Now notice when I'm clicked on the chart, my 4 areas at the bottom are slightly different. So now I have filters. Instead of columns, I have legend. Instead of rows, I have axes, and then I have values. So this is different to when I'm clicked within the pivot table. Okay, now I have columns and rows back again. So let's click on the pivot chart. And what I want to do is I want to be able to do a direct comparison on the chart between the sales for both of the stores. Currently, I'm only showing Microworld, but I want to see how they stack up against Computech. So what I'm going to do is move the store field to the legend area. And now I'm seeing both on this chart. I now need to change my chart title because it's no longer showing just Microworld, it's showing both. So I'm just going to delete out where it says Microworld. But very simply, I've been able to make a modification. And because the chart is linked to the pivot table, any changes you make will update in the pivot table and vice versa. Any changes you make to the pivot table will update in the pivot chart. So super simple. Now, what you can do is you can basically carry on going. So you can repeat this process of copying your pivot table to different worksheets, performing a different type of analysis, and creating different types of pivot chart to show your analysis. And this is where we start to move into the world of Excel dashboards. You may be familiar with them. They are very popular at the moment. Excel dashboards are basically just a whole bunch of pivot tables and pivot charts organized in different ways, and then the pivot charts are copy and pasted onto their own spreadsheet, and they're formatted into a nice looking dashboard. So you can basically display your key metrics in a nice way that's easy for everyone to understand. And that's all you do is you simply copy over and over again the worksheet, rearrange the pivot table fields, create a different chart, and then you can move the charts onto their own spreadsheet. Very, very straightforward. Now, the final thing I'm going to do here, just to make this a little bit nicer, is I'm actually going to remove because I've got everything overlapping. Let's remove these grand totals. I don't particularly need those. I'm going to turn them off for rows and columns. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply, just so everything matches nicely, let's just change the colors of this chart as well. So let's change it to something that looks like that. a different color palette so it looks a little bit nicer. Now the final couple of items, let's just do a time check, 7:20, we're in good time. The final couple of items I want to show you is how you can filter using slicers and then how you can update your data. Now, slicers, if you've never come across them before, slicers are basically just fancy visual filters and they are super user-friendly. And again, you'll see this a lot on Excel dashboards. So let me show you how they work. Now, I will say that when you are thinking about adding slicers, you want to make sure you have room for your slicers. Now, I haven't left any room for my slicers, so I'm just going to, let me just do a bit of reorganizing. I'm going to move my pivot table just by clicking it. I'm not very good at this with the mouse, and dragging it over here. And let's just move this chart underneath just there. So I've got a little bit of room here for me to add my slicers in. So if I click in my pivot table, up to Pivot Table Analyze, in the filter group, you have two different types of slicer. Now the insert timeline slicer is purely for any date columns that you have in your data, whereas this one is for everything else basically. So if I say insert slicer, it's going to pull up all of the column headings in your data except any that contain dates. And you can then choose what you want to filter by. So I'm going to add, let's add town, let's say store code, and I think that's it. Town and store code is fine. And click on OK. And it pulls up these really nice little panels, which you can then position wherever you like. And you can make these larger, you can make them smaller, you can really format them however you need them formatted. So I'm just going to place them underneath each other and drag them out. And you'll see that when I'm clicked on a slicer, slicers have their own contextual ribbons. So if you take a look up at your ribbons, you now have a slicer ribbon. And this is where you can do things like apply different slicer styles. So maybe I want to make it match my theme. Let's add that nice purple. And I can also do things like in this buttons area. Currently, I'm displaying one item per in the column, or one column, I should say. I can do 2 columns to make it look slightly different, 3 columns, so on and so forth. And these allow you to filter your data further. So if I'm only interested in seeing my pivot table and my pivot chart for the town of Bath, I can click on Bath and everything is going to update because these are linked to this pivot table. If you want to select multiple items, hold down your control key and select, and it will filter that data for you. Okay, you have a clear filter button in the top corner to clear out any selections that you make. So these are a really nice user-friendly way of everybody, even people with minimal Excel skills, maybe people who don't know how to filter pivot charts. It's a really simple way of them being able to do that. Okay, so filters are definitely something you should think about. And I'll very briefly show you the other filter or the other slicer that you have available. If I click back in my pivot table and go to Pivot Table Analyze, we have an insert timeline. Now, as I said, this one is only related to dates. So it's only showing me month. If you don't have any date columns in your data, then you won't be able to insert a timeline because you're not going to have anything to select just here. So I'm going to select month and click on OK, and I get a different style of filter. Now again, you should probably leave some room for this at the top. So let's just drag that down and move this up to the top. You can organize this a lot better than I am doing here, but I can drag that across, make it a bit wider. And this allows me to filter my data in a timeline. Now, my data only goes up to June 2019. So if I was to click in December, it's not going to show anything. But if I was to click January, it shows just the data for January. I can drag it across if I just want to see January to April, and everything updates nicely. Okay. Once again, you have a timeline ribbon at the top. So if you want to format it and do various other things, you can do. Okay. So those are the different types of filter that you have. Finally, just to finish out this session, I'm going to show you what happens when you update your data. Now, to do this, I think to demonstrate this, I'm going to, let's add in, shall I remove manager and change this to month? Yes, let's do it that way. So currently I'm only filtering January to April on this slicer. So I'm going to clear this so it shows everything. So now I have my months running in the vertical axis and then my sales data in horizontal. So as I said, my sales data, if we jump back to our original data and do a control down arrow, only runs to June. Now, obviously, this is sales data. The next month, in July, I'm going to add more data to the bottom just here. And fortunately, here's one I made earlier. I have more data here for July. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to add this data onto the end of this data set. And because I've put my data in a table, the table is going to auto expand to accommodate that new data, which means that if I want to update all of the pivot tables and pivot charts, I just have to click one button. It makes it so easy. That is why it's important to put your data in a table before you analyze. So let's jump to our data for July. I'm going to do Control A to select it all. Control C to copy it. Jump back to our data. I'm going to go to the last row. Control V to paste. Now I don't need these column headings, so let's just delete out that row. But because the table is auto expanded, it's now all part of that sales data range. So once you've added new data, if you jump back to any pivot tables or pivot charts that you've created, all you need to do, and let me move this down a bit so you can see, is click one button, and you'll see that when I do this, you'll see that the pivot table will add July's figures onto the bottom, and the pivot chart will also add July onto here. So if I jump up to Analyze in the data group, we have a refresh button. When I click refresh all, fingers crossed everyone, there we go. July's figures have now been added. That is so much easier than if you hadn't put your data in a table, you would have to go in and reselect the new cell range, the new data that you'd added. So much easier. That is why I put things in tables. Okay, we are just coming up to the hour. That is pretty much all I have time to show you today, guys. And believe me, we have just scratched the surface when it comes to the things you can do with pivot tables. But hopefully that's given you a nice introduction if these are new for you. And I hope you walk away today feeling like they maybe aren't quite as scary as they sometimes seem to be.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Sez IT.